Let me welcome you all to this session on gender. It's good to have you all here as part of this Talanoa conference at the ANU, and my regards to all of those hard-working organisers like Roanne. And I have to say it's a great pleasure today because this is a panel on gender, which is not just a series of women presenting. And in fact, women are being discussed. But also men are being discussed, and masculinity is being discussed. And so I think I'm a scholar who's worked for a very long time in the context of studies of gender and sexuality in the Pacific, and I'd have to say that too often the concept of gender equals women. And I think that this panel should reveal how that's a rather too narrow conception of what gender is about. So I've got great pleasure in welcoming the two presenters. I gather there was going to be someone else from Tonga, but who couldn't come in the last instance. These two presenters, Latu Latai and Eric Bridgman, I know very well. I've been working closely with them over the last wee while. Latu Latai, Reverend Latu Latai, is doing a PhD project at the moment as part of our project on engendering persons transforming things. And his project really flows on from a beautiful master's thesis in theology that he wrote, which was looking at the early experience of Samoan missionary couples, and particularly in PNG. And in the context of his present doctoral work, he's sort of expanding those questions both theoretically but also geographically over other parts of the Western Pacific. And I think his work, certainly, Latu, I think, has been writing lots of things over the last, it's now about 18 months, Latu, since she started your PhD. And in most recent time, he did a beautiful paper on the very first British London Missionary Society missionaries in Samoa. And that paper, called From Open Files to Mission Houses, I think really shows the kind of the poignancy of that first experience and the very big mistranslations, I suppose, that were going on between the imported ideas of gender from the perspective of the British and those ideas of gender which were there in Samoa, were of course the brother-sister relationship, if anything, is as important or more important than the husband-wife relationship. And so I'm going to ask Latu to speak first. And I think Latu's going to speak for about 20, 30 minutes, something like that. And then we'll have Eric, and I'm just going to give the introduction to Eric as well now, so I can kind of step aside and look at the slides. This year, as part of our Laureate project and also as part of Pacifica Australia's outreach, we've inaugurated quite an innovative new idea of Pacific Artists in Residence. And our first artist in residence, Carl Powell, was here in the month of July. He's an Indigenous Hawaiian artist, working with the students, creating a collaborative mural. But also, very interestingly, his work bears on questions about what is it to be an Indigenous Hawaiian man, and quite playful ideas of masculinity. Interestingly enough, Eric Bridgman, our second Pacific artist in residence, and Eric will tell you more about his life and background, but Eric, who's Papua New Guinean Australian, has also, a lot of his early photography, explored ideas about figures of men. I'm thinking in particular, Eric, of your photograph, Boy in inverted commas, labourer, and then a whole series of photographs looking at things to do with sports and Pacific men in the context of sport. So I think that this is going to be a great feast of words and a great feast of images. And so we'll let Latu start speaking, and I think Eric and I might retreat to the audience and look at his slides as well as he was going. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, for those kind words. And also thank the organizing committee for inviting me to speak at this be showing some pictures, and I apologize to those Malayan who have heard this so many times, because this is part of my thesis proposal seminar, and it's a work in progress. Now, talanoa in Samoa means to have a conversation. The word tala means story, so it's about the telling and the sharing of stories. Tala also means to reveal, as in talalo ngafa, meaning reveal who you are, your history and your genealogy. As in Samoa, in order to have a meaningful conversation, your identity and your relation and connection to others must be clear before you start a conversation. But tala also means to untie, or to disentangle, or straighten out, as in the act of talalepenga, of spreading out the fishing net in order to smooth out parts that have been entangled and to mend parts that have been torn and damaged before it is used again. So talanoa is not just about the sharing of stories, but it is also a way in which the process of mending, resolving, reconciling and healing takes place. And talanoa is very much an important part of the Samoan culture. Having said that, I begin my talanoa today by telling you a little bit about myself. And I hope I won't come across as boasting, because that is definitely not Samoan talanoa. But I want to do this in order to show how I came about doing this project. And I hope that my short talk will generate a good discussion in the end, and that together with your stories, we might resolve some of the questions and issues that we might encounter, particularly with gender and women. Now, a lot of people have asked me, why am I doing this research? And my simple answer is that because it is personal, something that is close to my heart. I am a son of missionary parents who worked in Papua New Guinea from 1959 to 1973. And when we left Samoa to go back to, when we left PNG to go back to Samoa, I was still a toddler, so I had no memory of my birthplace. But growing up in Samoa, I was always referred to as the Papuan boy. So I used to ask my parents lots of questions about this place, this great country that has become part of who I am and my identity. So as a young boy, I always asked questions to my parents about Papua. And I was always fascinated by their stories. And two particular stories stuck with me at a very young age. One was my mom's stories about when she went to give birth to each of us. And every time she was about to give birth, she had to travel on this single-hull canoe with an outboard motor on the river so that she can get to the nearest district hospital at a place called Kapuna. And when my parents worked in the Gulf region, around the Fly River, the mouth of the Fly River, and this was the only way to commute, was to travel on these canoes. So it was quite dangerous because there were often strong currents, and of course there were crocodiles, snakes, and mosquitoes carrying malaria, of course. So as a child, I always had this image of my mom as a very brave and courageous young woman in Papua New Guinea. The other story that was told to me by my father was when they were first posted to a village called Dobima. And if you remember, this is the village where the famous missionary Chalmers was killed and eaten by the locals. And my father said that when they went there, they were told by the locals of how the people killed Chalmers and ate his body, including his boots, which they tried to cook, and unfortunately they find it quite distasteful. So I found that quite amusing at the time. So as I grew up in Samoa, I always remember these stories about Papua. But it was not until I decided to enter seminary at Ma'alua Theological College, much to the relief of my parents at the time, that my interest in Samoa's involvement in mission really began. And as I read and learn, I became quite amazed at this history. And two things really struck me at the time. First was the long association of Samoans in mission work, which started in 1833, and the last missionaries left in Papua New Guinea in 1977, which was more than a century and a half. On the other hand was the extent of this mission, which covered more than 10 different countries and much of the Western Pacific region. So because of this renewed interest, I began to have more conversations with my mother, and this was really the beginning of this research. I wanted to tell my mother's story because I felt that it was important. My father had passed away, unfortunately, at the time, so it made it even more important for me to record my mother's account. And this work. And one of the things that I found out about my mother was that it was her that really wanted to go to Papua. I always thought it was my father because I thought that was the reason why he entered seminary. But no. My mother said that as a young girl, she always wanted to go to Papua, and I asked her why. And she said that this was because she grew up at Ma'alua Theological College, where her father was a teacher there. And she always heard stories from returning missionaries from Papua, and this is what inspired her. So she made up her mind at quite a young age. She met my father while he was a student there, and as soon as my father graduated, they got married and left for mission. She was very determined because on the same day that my father graduated, they got married in the afternoon, and then the following Monday, they spent their honeymoon on the steamer called Tofua on their way to their first mission in Papua New Guinea. And this is a picture of them got married on Saturday, and on Monday they left. And this is the photo taken in Fiji in front of the court building there in Suva. This was before they left to go to Sydney and then to Papua New Guinea. Yeah, so they were quite young at the time. She was only 21 when she married my father. But having interviewed my own mother, I then decided that I should also interview other missionary women. And these are some of the ladies that I also managed to interview. And I found that this was very important because, as you can see, these were the last surviving missionary wives, and some of them have already passed away. And most of them are in old age now. Now, this group of women, however, belong to the latter part of this long history of Samoan involvement in mission from the 1940s to the 70s. So really, this was the last chapter of this long history, which began way back in 1839, only 9 years after Christianity was introduced in Samoa in 1830. The first places that the Samoans went to are Rotuma, Vanuatu, Loyalty Islands, and New Caledonia. The Samoans were the first to introduce Christianity in these places, but they didn't stay long. And these early missions, particularly in southern Vanuatu and New Caledonia, were quite tragic for the Samoans, as they suffered greatly, and many of them died. And there were several reasons for this. One was because of the strong resistance from local religious practitioners who felt threatened by the Samoans' presence. Secondly, because of the many epidemics that hit this region at this time. Many were killed, and often the Samoans were blamed for introducing these diseases. And thirdly was the strong suspicion about foreigners, particularly because of blackbirding or the slave trade that was going on in this part of the Pacific. It was during this early time that the first Samoan martyrs were killed, and included was a Samoan woman. And I found this quite fascinating. It's whose name is not even mentioned, but was known as the wife of a Samoan named Apela. And this occurred on the island of Futuna. And the story goes that after the village killed Apela and the other Samoan missionary while they were working in the plantation, then the village men went back to the village to kill the wife. The chief offered to spare her life only if she becomes his wife. However, she refused and was then struck down, and her baby was also killed. We hear a lot of stories about the great killing of missionaries like John Williams and the Chalmers, of course, but these stories we hardly ever hear of. There are many other sad accounts, but the Samoans eventually left these places and other missions took over. In other places like Niue, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Papua New Guinea and Torres Strait, the Samoans' presence was quite long and profound, and their impact is still evident today. Overall, the Samoans was the largest missionary force in the Pacific. There was about 620 missionary couples in total. That's the number that I managed to collate at the time, but there could be more. In 1883, they finally reached the Torres Strait and Papua New Guinea, which was the last frontier of the missionary course. Although they were not the first Pacific Islanders there, they were no less pioneering, and they soon dominated the mission there. Once there, they took it upon themselves as their duty and responsibility to continue the mission work. Some of the most moving letters which appeared for help and recruits were written by Samoans abroad. And these were published in the Sulu, which is a Samoan magazine, and I've translated some of the extracts from the letters here. This is the place where Samoans were, this whole region here. And if you can see here, this is where my parents were first placed. And these are some of the letters that sort of really encourage people back home to join the missionary work. And it's interesting the kind of metaphors that they use, like digging gold, and there's clearing the forest, and so encouraging those in Malua to come. This is I was very privileged to find this picture. This is one of the first pictures ever taken of Samoan missionaries. And Sumeo and his wife, they arrived in Papua New Guinea in 1883. He died in 1900. So they were the first missionaries in Papua New Guinea. So by 1930, the LMS Church sent out the largest group of missionaries in Papua. They total about 75% of all the missionaries sent at the time. And when the last Samoan missionary couples left PNG in 1977, the number of Samoan missionaries to work in PNG was more than 350. So in retrospect, the Samoans' enthusiasm for mission was clearly evident. And according to Elizabeth Roach, many volunteered, many devoted their entire lives, and more than a few died in service. Now, the extent of the Samoan mission was huge, and as I said, covered about 2/3 of the Western Pacific. And these places, they were quite different from what they were used to at home, particularly places like Rotuma, Niue, Tuvalu, Tokelau. Although they were closer to Samoa, the physical and geographical features were quite different. But there were similarities in terms of language and also culturally. However, in places like Vanuatu and much of that Melanesian group, the Samoans find these places too much more foreign to them. The cultures and the languages were quite different. And the diversity of the languages is something that they really struggled with. Another important difference is the climate and also the land mass uh, the variety of birds and animals that Samoans were never introduced to, like poisonous snakes, crocodiles, etc. In Micronesia, the Samoans also discovered new environments, like atolls were quite new to them, with low-lying islands of coral origin. There was also great scarcity of water. There were long droughts. The soil was quite different from the volcanic soil in Samoa, so they were not able to get the same sort of crops that they were used to in the islands. So in these places, a lot of Samoans took with them their own banana varieties and taro varieties and try to grow them there. Now, gender relations in most of the Western Pacific region was also quite different to Samoa. In places like Vanuatu and PNG, the roles of women was quite different, more physically demanding than back in Samoa, where women were, as sisters, were given a very esteemed sacred status. So, thus, Samoan missionary wives were also confronted with these different status of women in the Western Pacific. There has been a lot of work done on Samoan missionaries, and I note them here. But these are all important works, but the focus is mainly on Samoan male missionaries with very little emphasis on their wives. In the missionary records, these women are often referred to as wives, next to the names of their husbands. The scarce mention of their names in the archives of missionary activities in the Pacific imparts a kind of an eerie silence, since these women were equal in numbers to their husbands. Their personal experiences and perspectives, edited out of most mission records and indigenous memories and historical consciousness, presents an unfortunate gap in the history. And through archival and oral histories, I hope my research will allow these women's names and stories to be heard, recorded and interpreted, giving perhaps novel and nuanced ways of looking at the history of mission in the Pacific. An example of, I've been collecting these data from the missionary archives. If you know, there's always the male name, but women were always referred to as wife. So my research really is to recuperate the voice of Samoan women in the history of mission. And one of the unfortunate things that I've found about the current history are these stereotyped description of Samoan women, not only by missionaries and colonial observers, but also by historians and scholars. I've noted that these quotes here, like Samoan women's wives were living as queens in finer houses than the local elites, waited on hand and foot, so they sit and take their ease. I think McGregor was the worst one. The Samoan wives were great swells, big ugly, and in handsome, great usher. So, but through this research, I've discovered that most of these women were far more than just queens waiting for servants from the locals. In my own research, I've discovered that they contributed a lot more in terms of education, in terms of health, and particularly in terms of leadership for women in places they went to. And one of the biggest contributions of Samoan missionary wives was in mobilizing women in the Western Pacific, in forming women's friendships, which are still very much active today. In hindsight, not all of these women were perfect, but the majority of them made great contributions. There is also a need to understand these women's role from a Samoan cultural perspective. These women were not photocopies of European missionary wives. Their roles as wives of Samoan pastors were deeply linked to Samoan ideas about gender and personhood. So it is important to understand them from those perspectives. Now, there are several key areas that I'm interested in this study, and I'll note only two here. The first one is to examine the colonial impact on the indigenous models of gender in Samoa and the Pacific, looking at the transformation of these in encounter with Christian models introduced by missionaries and other colonial agents. Samoan missionary wives were at the forefront of the transformation of Samoan society, in particular, the novel Christian emphasis on the ideal model of husband and wife. They were trained to be wives of Samoan pastors and thus represented a novel model of women in Samoan society. But was there an indigenization of these models? This is also important in looking at wider debates about the extent of the colonial impact on indigenous women in the Pacific. Several studies on Pacific women have shown the destructive impact of the colonial process on women, while others have shown that although the introduction of Western models overall has affected women negatively, the impact was varied in different localities and in some places positive. This challenged the view that there was a one-way directionality in European expansion. Rather, we should be more aware of more complex processes of both loss and creation, adaptation and distancing, collusion and confrontation. Secondly, to re-examine the status and representations of women in Samoa and also the wider Pacific in light of colonialism and Christianity. For example, representation of women in the Pacific since the arrival of Europeans based on very racial and hierarchical ideologies. Like women in Polynesia were often represented as beautiful, although not according to McGregor, sexually alluring, who did refined work and revered and elevated. On the other hand, women in Melanesia were depicted as ugly, sexually unappealing, and sexually sequestered beasts of burden, cruelly oppressed by men. But although there were differences, all Pacific women were considered lower and inferior to the idealized Western woman. Hence, the missionary effort to rescue them from cultural oppression. This project went right across the Pacific, although this was much stronger in the Western Pacific than in the East. And Samoan missionary wives were some of the first Polynesian women to enter Melanesian society. Now the question is, how did they perceive themselves in light of these somehow racist categorizations? Finally, my research is important for me in thinking about certain issues relating to the status and valuation of women in Samoa today. The irony that I see in doing this research is that after all the contributions that Samoan women have made to the church in Samoa, the issue of women in leadership roles in Samoa is still a much debated one. Samoa is probably one of the last few countries in the Pacific that have yet to ordain women. But now there are those who are claiming this right to be ordained ministers of the church. And I would like to end with this slide. On a recent fieldwork to Samoa, the issue of ordination of Samoan women made the headline news in the newspaper. And Reverend Marie Robetti, some of you might know, who is an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand, married a minister of our church, the Congregational Christian Church of Samoa, a few years ago. Since then, they have looked after the CCCS parish in Auckland. However, on the 22nd February this year, he was appointed by the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand to serve at the Pacific Island Presbyterian Church in Auckland. As a result, the elders of the CCCS in Samoa has called for the resignation of both the minister and his reverend wife, and that the covenant between the parish and the minister had to be broken on the basis that this was unconstitutional and not in line with Samoan protocol. According to the spokesperson of the CCCS, this ban is not because we do not want Marie to work, It's because Marie does not want to be a faletua or wife of a pastor. And as such, it means she's not there on Sundays to do a faletua's work, as stipulated under our denomination service. Now, as a church minister, I truly believe in the importance of the role of women in leadership, not just in Samoa, but the whole of the Pacific. Equal opportunities for women. The potential for progress and development in our region in the future, I think, really depends on this, on education of women and the role they should play in leadership. But in order to talk about these issues moving forward, we must also acknowledge the important roles and contribution of women in the past and in our histories. I would like to quote from Margaret Jolly, her beautiful words. If we are not able to recuperate the agency of indigenous people from the tyranny of the writing of colonial Pacific past, through stressing, entanglement, and appropriation, perhaps we might consider similar revisions of Pacific women in the present. So if older-fashioned colonial history focused on Europeans, the newer history simply reversed the polarities and elevates islanders and islander women as the new empowered agents of history. If we are to talk about the importance of women in leadership roles in the Pacific today, we might start by also acknowledging their huge contributions in the past and in our histories, as I've tried to convey through the history of Samoan missionary wives. Thank you.
Don't sit down. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I think that was really a profoundly interesting start by talking to us about the very concept of talanoa and how in any kind of conversation, questions about where you're coming from and your own personal experience and genealogy are absolutely sort of pivotal. So I think that what we might do is take some questions now, then we'll listen to Eric, and then we'll take some questions specifically to him, and then we'll open up for more general discussion if that suits people. But could I then just invite people in the audience? Perhaps it might be an idea if you say who you are, so that we're all a bit sort of aware of each other. And so we'll probably take 5-10 minutes, whatever, however it goes. So, please, thank you.
I just want to congratulate you and to say thank you for an inspiration piece of work that you are, more than a piece of work they've done, and that resonates with a lot of us, like myself, thinking about my mother who labored 30 years, and as soon as father died, she was out of the scene. Thank you.
I'm Karen O'Donnell. I'm retired now, but I used to work in a health faculty. And the view very much there was that women's potential for equality depended very much on taking their role as basically reproduction around children, and that the empowerment of women and family planning was kind of struck me at this conference that one of the problems, it seems to me, for many cultures is that on a small amount of land is a kind of fundamental problem, but it hasn't been discussed at this conference. And so for me, I'm just wondering what your view is of the proposition that for women, the empowerment of women depends fundamentally on planning and contraception.
I'm not a woman.
No, but you do have sperm. So it's a big issue for men as well.
One hand raised my name. Well, thank you for your presentation, which is quite eye-opening for me. We regards to women in Samoa. As a result of your work, how do you think that will be received by your church back in Samoa with regards to the ordination of women?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I can talk about particularly my own church, CCCS. I think we have already passed in our constitution to ordain women. But when would that happen is a different question. And my experience when I was teaching at Marvel Theological College for 5 years is that a lot of women, I talked to the wives of students there and I asked them what they think of women ordained, and the majority of women said that even them themselves, they don't agree that women should be ordained.
So is it fear or is it just institutional that you need a cultural
Yes.
change,
And I think-
change, because seeing that it's already passed, my question there is why is there a when? So is there a fear in women because it's been institutionalized and therefore need a cultural change within the church, or?
Yeah, I think the cultural aspect is very important because I know that in American Samoa, the church there had went ahead and ordained the first church women ministers. And the problem is none of the villages ever asked these women to come and look after their parishes. So it's still very much a cultural thing. And until that is changed, then I think it will be a lot more acceptable.
So just one last question. Is that linked to doctrinal or more cultural?
Cultural.
Cultural. Okay, so cultural change.
Because, just to follow up on your question, is in Samoa, in my research now, I'm looking at this concept of the whaletua, and the Samoans see the whaletua as a complementary to the minister, and they say that without the whaletua, the minister
Can you translate to interpret that
Wife,
word?
ministers,
the wife of
the
the
wife of the
the
minister.
minister.
There is a literal translation to that, isn't it?
Yes, the
The
feminine.
back room or back kitchen or.
Yeah, but that's a Samoan feminist interpretation of whaletua. A literal interpretation meaning the house at the back.
Yes.
But really, the word whaletua is a house of wisdom upon which the chief depends on for advice.
It's got a deeper meaning.
So it's got a more deeper meaning. So the wife of a lead chief is called a whaletua. And whaletua really refers to her advisory role. Maybe our chief here can help explain that.
We would be here all night. I have a question.
Please.
Pastor Mole Tapana, I'm really glad they picked this topic as your PhD. It takes courage and being a value yourself. I absolutely love what you're doing. My question is to do with the arrival of the missionaries, well, on the Westerners. And you even had the evidence of academics that wrote about the topic much later. I guess I'm asking about the role of the missionaries that brought your church to Samoa. Setting up a special college, a special school to train and induct young women, primarily with the ultimate purpose and aim of providing potential wives for the 5 hours. How much influence did that your church missionaries initiative to almost inculcate particular values into these young women young ladies to then become volunteers, you know, to in their work. I'm curious about whether the ultimate purpose of setting that school up had actually, you know, perpetuated or started even, because it's still there. So that after 160 years nearly, that it's still there. Have you looked at that kind of, what was the ultimate kind of?
I'm currently looking at this idea of the domestication thesis, which the idea with the which was very true to some extent in the cases of LMS missionaries and all European missionaries in the Pacific, who came with the extent of transforming women, these women, into the European ideal of the wife. You know, as the wife to the
Thank you for saying that, because that was what I was wanting to know.
But
Whether it was a deliberate intent on the part of the missionaries to actually turn young Samoan women to actually be put through that kind of process, which in a way shaped and configured their thinking, their practice.
But we've been discussing this a lot with Margaret, and there certainly seems to be a paradox to this domestication thesis in terms of the Samoan mission, the European LMS missionary wives presenting this ideal model of the wife. But in fact, they were not even doing that. There were a lot of cases where a lot of them send their own children back home in England. A lot of them, particularly these special schools like Kapota, where girls were trained for the purpose of marrying missionaries. But these schools were conducted by single missionaries. So the paradox there, that they were trying to teach these women to be wives, but in fact, they were presenting a different ideal of a woman as wife. And a lot of these schools, like the Kapota Girls' School, are no longer, you know, they're dying out because women no longer see that school as, you know, they no longer want to be just wives to ministers, but now they want to be lawyers, accountants. So these mission schools are now in decline as women move to government school, which provide training for other different positions. So the whole idea of the domestication thesis, as I said, it's a very controversial, a lot of debates around that.
So, Latu, I think I'm going to move the conversation on, if that's okay. Do you want to ask your question now, or can I wait? What do you think? Short one?
Yeah. One of the issues that we face here in Australia, having understand the role of a woman or the status of women, not so much in the church, but in the wider Samoan community, correct me if I'm wrong, and also with the Tongan context, the women are elevated, and it's a concept for the Samoan context and concept for the Tongan concept, which is the whahau. The question that was posed to some of us in forums like this, why is it that the status of women are elevated and yet there's a lot of abuse by men? Why is it like the brother-sister relationships, which are very much Samoan, Tongan, Niuean, and yet there is, you know, and it's happening a lot here, Samoa, Tonga. So that's another paradox, I think, to look at.
That's a very good and very important point. Because often women in Samoa often portray this impression of them as being held in the very high elite status, while women in Melanesia, of course, are culturally oppressed but I think we have to be very careful in terms of how women in Samoa, for example, are represented. That these views cannot represent, they only represent a few, but not, you know, all women in Samoa. That is very much true. Yeah.
So Lottie, we might just end that talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks to everybody for inviting me to be part of this talk, and it was sort of, I guess I don't really know too much about Talanoa and the meaning, so it was nice to hear about that, because it's, I guess it just put into perspective what I'm actually doing. So I guess I'll start by introducing myself. My name's Eric Bridgman, and I'm an artist in many ways. I'm not an academic at this point. And I grew up, my father's from Queensland, my mother's from Chimbu in Papua New Guinea. And I grew up mostly, went to school in Queensland, and sort of during childhood would go back and have these little adventures there, but sort of mainly started going back on my own when I was in my late teens. And since then I've started to, I guess, establish a bit of a double base here in Australia and in New Guinea. But what I'm presenting sort of today is a number of different works I've been doing in the last few years. I finished at the Queensland College of Art in Brisbane, Griffith University, finished up in photography. So that was 2008/2009, and since then, sort of the ball has sort of kept on rolling. I've been doing international residencies in the US and Canada and the UK. So a lot of travelling, and a lot of actually in between those, staying in New Guinea, doing work in Sydney and Melbourne as well, and sort of living like a bit of a gypsy, and you know, just trying new things and trying whatever. So this is actually one of my uni photos that went in my uni days. So this is about 2008, but it sort of does sum up about me. I guess my practice ranges from photography to installation, video, performance art, painting, sculpture, sort of anything that really I can, you know, I guess it depends on what is pressing at the time with the work, and then how best to put it together. So I mean, really, like, sort of being at an early age, I was a bit conscious of being from sort of actually feeling sort of from neither here nor there. So I mean, that's sort of something that everybody in that position goes through, but I think I decided to use it and explore it, and probably at an early age I was a bit of an observer of things that were going on around me. And so where am I? And I don't really like to prepare too much. I like to prepare my pictures because they sort of tell their stories and things like that. So actually 2008, I was 21, and I produced my first body of work. This was sort of straight after finishing the photography program. Then I went more into interdisciplinary sculpture and started playing around with all sorts of other mediums and ways of doing things. So at this moment I was sort of really finding myself in between cultures. Not that I was trying to really pinpoint it on anything, it was just like, I would just be like, well, I guess first, this sort of, this is like one of the final images. This is a big photographic body of work. But I guess, because this is sort of the start of, I guess, a big discussion. And just to sort of start it off, like a lot of my work evokes questions rather than answers. And even, when I'm making it, I'm sort of going through those questions about, identity is always there. And, identity is, I don't know, I'm sort of always trying to push a bit further with it. I don't sort of try to, well, I guess, I don't know, some people say I'm a bit of a punk, but I wouldn't say that too much. But it's sort of, sort of a bit radical in a way. Not even radical, but I guess I've always, even now, like I find it, well, my work sort of belongs in the context of contemporary art. Sometimes even, it's sort of like on the side of like even Pacific art. So it's sort of, it's still that same thing going on with being neither here nor there. So actually, it's kind of interesting. I'm here, but I'm enjoying it. And I haven't, even through childhood, even through now, like, I sort of am comfortable with my identity, and that's sort of not really the issue anymore. But at this time, it sort of was. And this time I was going back more regularly. But this sort of work was more to do with representation, ethnographic portraiture, but sort of based on my own observations, with growing up in a sort of working class area, but also having these, I guess, desires to really, bilas or send my place. So I had this sort of natural, I guess, attraction to dress-ups. But, so it was sort of like bilas in New Guinea, that's, traditional dress and all those sorts of things. So actually when I was making this, I wasn't actually conscious of that, but then it sort of spawned into everything else. So actually, this was my character. It eventuated after like 10 performance videos, and then we got to this final character. This was somebody else's character, but they were all sort of put together by myself. And, there's all sorts of different symbols, ideas, to do with portraiture, to do with exotification, to do with the exotic, to do with people immediately read this and think blackface and gollywogs. And that's cool. I mean, that's fine. But I think when I was making this one, it was more like, I think I was actually thinking more about moving away from anyway. So it was, it's sort of just, this sort of stuff, it's like a big family portrait of different ideas of self and that I sort of relate to, but many other Pacific people would read something into it that they can get from it, and that's how I mean about it being sort of questions rather than answers. So I've had various sort of people be attracted to different things for different reasons. I remember I got in trouble for this one. It was published as an invite, and it was an indigenous gallery, and they thought I was a white guy dressing up white, and so I got into some debate with the indigenous artists and elders in Queensland about this image, and after all that, it was kind of really good because it made me think about, well, this is how I'm different from you guys, and you see it as me sort of demonizing, but it was that was sort of more an issue about blackness, so rather than gender. So the work does cross a lot of things like gender, masculinity, race, you know, and this is sort of just like a concoction, a soup of a lot of ingredients, and that's how I see it. Actually, I did sort of name these. This one I named after my grandmother. So a lot of the things do belong to my family. A lot of the things were brought from like my dad's side, which is all the construction stuff. So it's all that sort of hybridized sort of imagery. I mean, this is sort of the stuff that launched me into, I guess, whatever I'm doing, and you know, getting shows and so it was attractive to many people in many ways, and at the time I sort of wasn't really sure why, but you know, and this work sort of did go into football as well, and that, you know, that was sort of just responding to things that are around me, things that I grew up with, things that are, you know, just things that you see. But I have a way of, I guess, turning it into some sort of extreme parody that's sort of ridiculous, but it's sort of like reality sort of spun out of control, and
Can I ask a question?
yes, please.
I can't help but to ask a question.
Sure.
I'm so attracted to the play of colors. You know, what does that, you know, mean? There's colors are striking.
Yeah.
You painted yourself green,
Yeah.
white, red.
No,
Yeah, I just,
Well, it's that. I mean,
can't-
that's sort of at this time it was sort of just a natural sort of subconscious thing coming out of me. So I was thinking, you know, I was just like, and then sort of I started to put it together that, hang on, this is like my boo-boos coming through and all these sort of things from New Guinea that, you know, just sort of were in me already, sort of attracting to colour and all those things. And that's something I've used throughout constantly as a play on colour. And you know, it's I guess the manipulation of colour to sort of, you know, very much, you know, to design. Yeah, and if anybody else has any comments or questions throughout, please.
Have you ever considered yourself a caricaturist, or have been described as one? Because I feel like it has a heavy element of caricature.
Yeah.
And the more you talk about it, the more it kind of draws me into this manipulation and kind of turning symbols and images on their head, and they're very confronting.
No, that's true. No, I've heard that a lot. It's just sort of sometimes I can't keep up with what I'm called.
Yeah.
So
when I switch my gaze from just like taking them in without any mediation, when I kind of switch my gaze to a viewer of advertising or fashion photography, then I really see, I kind of start seeing it a different way. And I can see how this could really talk to somebody that is more influenced or is more educated in that kind of visual art.
See, like, no, that's totally kind of right on, because I finished my photography degree when I made this, and sort of the big thing that photography did was, I guess, teach me what I just really dislike about commercial photography, photojournalism. It was just like, okay, I have all the stuff that I don't like, so I'm going to make stuff that sort of plays on that, plays on all the stuff that I don't like about it, plays on the stuff that I want to engage with as well. So it does have that quality to it as well. And some of these were made for a commission for it was like a big glowing sort of busway. It was lit up like, you know, like advertisements, like commercial photography. I mean, it's That's right. And these ones have been on many magazine covers as well. So, because I think even through now, I'm always, looking at what is projected out there by the media, by advertising, and it's just really grinds my gears, sort of some things, about representation, how, and what's sort of fed into things. So I try to rebut that a little bit, or just, because some things, and this is just sort of my way of doing it, really. This one was a work made in 2010 based on this one. This was, what was it? It was made for a sports prize, actually. It was $100,000, but I didn't win. But it was, I mean, sort of, I think, it was the Ian Potter Museum in Melbourne a couple of years ago. And so, it was sort of like, I don't have a background in sculpture, but, I have a background in, I guess, visual, it's more like visual language, and sort of like, I just try to find a different way to do it, to make it more effective, or just whatever. So this one was, his name's Wilma. So, this one sort of, when I was talking about, I guess, the hybridization of, the black and the white, sort of very bold, simple ways of looking at it. But I was thinking with this one more about the racial debates in football, and also sexuality debates in football. And I think at this time it was more about, like, I was sort of using the other stuff, but sort of it went in a new direction when I got obsessed with, I think, Gods of Football, and there's a calendar, and there was a lot of suggestive things about footballers that you get all the time, and I was just like, okay, let's just stop messing about. So this is another range of performance things that I've done. Federation Square. Paste ups. This work was about, it was talking about, and I think it was sort of the anniversary of when Andrew Johns and Tamata, who had that fight, and so it was sort of the anniversary of that, like a year after, and I think I always respond to popular debates in football, because sometimes, it's sort of like, it happens every year, there's something different every year, and the media sort of really eats it up, and in some ways that aren't good. But, so what, with this sort of debate, I'm sort of like, I guess I'm representing it. Oh, this was this one-off. This is this one-off debate. It's more like, this stuff is always there. So that was more of a performance work outside the MCA in Sydney. Where am I now?
Did you get reactions when you were
Oh,
in
yeah.
that MCA?
Yeah, there was, because that was like, they were in the middle of construction of the new building there, and there was like all these construction guys on the other side coming up to see, and and so half of them were like yelling at me, and half of them, it's sort of like you get that, half of them see the humour in it, and half of them are just like, you're really disturbing, our thing, this is, me personally, like I'm a nice guy, I think, but sort of just I just know how to twist, like push people's buttons, and that's sort of my role, I think. And I sort of enjoy doing it because it's a lot of times it's things that people just don't want to talk about in that way. And so I'm just sort of highlighting something and presenting it. So I've sort of like gone around, I mean, I'm sort of just picking a few works here. But are there any questions actually? Because I'm sort of a bit lost in my,
I'm forgetting, so yes, come on.
I appreciate your art, and
Yeah.
I think you're really, really good at your craft, and I really do see the art in it, so well done. I did want to ask though, say a piece such as this one that you're showing us now, can you tell us what the inspiration is behind it? Like what's the symbolism of the fork and the light bulbs and the paint across the lips, because I see that as a theme through your work.
Yeah, it was about the construction of identity being, because it's sort of like, I think I was sort of in a way trying to decide, which thing I belong to, but sort of it was more like, it being something I could either choose to fully become or not. So it's more about like fluidity, I guess, and being able to move around. So, I mean, I did use my friends. They're actually all white people, which, I mean, that caused a bit of a fuss, but I sort of said, well, these are my friends, but they're my canvases, and their bodies, but that's sort of questionable, but I wanted to make these images for my reasons, so they're involved. I mean, they got harassed sometimes, for that sort of stuff. And I actually thought it was kind of interesting because the difference between blacking up in Western culture compared to like in New Guinea, where my grandma blacks up a lot of the time for different types of Sing Sing. Of course it has its different histories, but I always found it a bit weird coming, being in Australia and trying to do things and just having this like, you can't. But I'm like, yeah, I can. But yeah.
If you lived in Papua for like 5 years per se, and do you think your art form would evolve into something else and it'll be very Pacific, or do you think you'll still bring the contemporary into the Pacific element?
Yeah, it's a bit like that, because I'm sort of presenting my individual work, but I do have works under the way that are actually being made in my village that are more inclusive of my village. I've got a house there which I'm trying to turn into a base, and it's sort of, I guess I just want to, because I mean I'm sort of reflecting on a lot of my own personal experiences, and they can relate to some people in any way, but I definitely, when I go to New Guinea, I respond to different things because it's and I sort of so I have been really, because I find that there's a place for this stuff as well.
Yeah.
There's a place for this stuff, but there's also a place for my other work that I want to do in New Guinea. And it's sort of, I mean, I've always been trying to juggle them, and that's, you can tell visually in the work. So I'm sort of trying to like be like, okay, this work belongs to Eric Bridgman. He's from Australia, and going into New Guinea, I take my work back and show them, and they're like, yeah, that's really cool. But to sort of, when I go back, I just feel like, oh, all that stuff doesn't matter anymore. All this contemporary art crap, it's sort of like, because the way I think, the way I think in Australia as an artist is very different to when I'm based in New Guinea, and it's just like, oh, that's cool, but it's a really different way of thinking. So it's sort of affected me in the last few years about, what do I actually want to do? Do I want to be, what do I want to make with my work? So actually, the work I'm doing while based here is not really related to any of this at all. It's work that I made with my cousins in Western Highlands, where I have a house, and sort of it's, you know, but it still has that element of play, and you know, they're sort of young street mummies. So it's sort of very, it has the same performative and playful elements, but it's talking about different things. But yeah.
Sorry, there's just a question here and then.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks.
Were you ever a graffiti artist in the...
Oh, when I was younger.
The other one too.
Not when I was younger. My brother was. Only now, actually, I've started to do things in the street. Not, you know, not all the time, but yeah, I do a bit of street artwork. But I'm really lousy with the spray can, actually. So
Yeah, and so Carol, then yourself.
I was just going to ask how you think when you're in New Guinea. You said you think really differently when you're in New Guinea about your own work. How do you think when you're in New Guinea?
well, it's more like, I feel that this, I feel, sort of when I, in the last few years, and making work for like contemporary art galleries and things like that, not that I'm forcing it, but it's more like I am, I guess, giving a lot of attention to that, to that side of that sort of art world. When I go to New Guinea, it's just like, that, it just doesn't mean as much to me anymore. Sort of their opinions, what they want, and how they're going to respond to things. So I think it's about lifestyle as well, and even just things in my village are just, you know, the different importance, I guess. So I sort of just lose all this stuff when I go there, and I don't know, like it's just a different, because I'm still sort of sorting sorting out my work. You know, I'm just sort of a bit wanting just sort of in tune with how things. Yeah, is that? I don't know. Can you? Is that? It's all. I mean, it's just all. It's just. I mean, it's just all a bit questionable. Like, I'm not really satisfied to sit as a contemporary artist. You know, the token Papua New Guinean contemporary artist who makes, you know, crazy stuff. And you know, because that's sort of, you know, in a bit of a way, that's sort of how I started getting my shows, because I was seen as this contemporary New Guinea guy, and you know, I sort of resisted that from the start, but you know, so that's why I've always started to try to change it up, and that's sort of probably why I'm, you know, I'm not really that comfortable being put into like a totally Pacific show, even though I am sometimes. It's because I don't really know what I want to be. Like, I just sort of, you know, even though I want to have a base in New Guinea, I sort of also want to do work in, say, the UK and Berlin and do all sorts of stuff. And so it's sort of, you know, whenever somebody puts me in a thing, I'm just like, no, we're going this way now. So yeah, I mean, it's because I guess I started out with just jumped into the whole art world game. It was sort of just more like, okay, I'm really questioning it now. When you got people writing about your work and sort of dictating to you where you fit and what it's about, it's sort of always interesting. So I'm sort of always trying to get away from anything.
I'm just going to take one more.
That was done in the other room really represents what I think you guys and all the questions that pop up today. As you see, I'm always all grey, which tells that I'm one of the old hands that's still around. I think that's where Talanoa comes in, if my thinking is right. There's so many criticism. You know, I think 30 years ago, if I remember right, is that when you wake up in the morning, you go and enjoy what's out there. But 50 years later, you don't enjoy what you see out there. All you do is criticize what you can see. I think that's where Talanoa comes in and help, because like the session that the Reverend was talking about, is that either, like what the iceberg said, it's either we change our belief to accommodate the criticism and what we see today, or go back and do the things in the old ways. You know, it's like the culture, as you're trying to explain. You know, whether you have to change your culture to make people happy. You know, with where you live now. So the balancing, I don't know where the balancing is going to come in, and whether anyone can balance it and make it happy. Like there are sensitive issues in life, like especially in my culture as well, that I don't think I will ever change just to accommodate someone that criticizes what I believe, just like you trying to. So, you know, the question is,